And we are here today proposing legislation that is intended to take a significant step toward preventing Wisconsin from ever having another backlog of untested sexual assault kits. I'm going to talk about the details of the legislation in a minute, but first let me thank some of those who were involved in preparing this legislation and bringing this group together. Jamie Council Barker, the president of the Wisconsin chapter of the International Association of Forensic Nurses, thank you for your support. Beloit Police Chief David Zavadsky, some members of the AG's sexual assault response team, that includes Officer Kelly Andrechik from the UW Parkside Police Department, Beloit Police Captain Dan Mulland, who in Beloit did extensive work to inventory Beloit's sexual assault kits. And I think the work that he has done is really a model for what law enforcement agencies hopefully can be doing around the state. Assistant DA Crystal Jensen from the Eau Claire County DA's office. Sexual assault nurse examiner Deanna Grundle from Aurora Healthcare. Ian Henderson from the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And Manuel Cerda from Unidos. In addition to that, we have, as I mentioned, a bipartisan group of legislators who are coming forward in support of this legislation. That includes Representative Steffen, who's going to be speaking next, and has helped bring together this legislative coalition. Representative Sargent, who has worked on legislation regarding sexual assault kits in multiple sessions now. Senator Cowles and Senator Schachtner, who are the Senate authors. Also here is Representative Chris Taylor, who also has been a leading voice in the legislature on reform when it comes to our sexual assault kit laws. And then Senator Schachtner, I should have mentioned, could not be here today, but is one of the Senate authors. Also, I wanted to specifically mention Representative Macco, Representative Thiesfeld, who has also worked on legislation regarding sexual assault kits, and Senator Alberta Darling, who has supported reform efforts in this respect as well. Under current Wisconsin law, there's no comprehensive statutory framework for the collection and processing of sexual assault kits. This legislation will change that. First, it provides survivors of sexual assault with the option of whether to report to law enforcement. If a survivor chooses not to report to law enforcement, under this legislation, sexual assault kits will be stored at the crime lab for up to 10 years or until the survivor decides to make a report to law enforcement. If a survivor does report to law enforcement, at that point, a sexual assault nurse examiner under this legislation will have 24 hours to notify law enforcement to collect the sexual assault kit. Law enforcement will then have 72 hours to collect that kit from the sexual assault nurse examiner. And then within 14 days under this legislation, that kit must be sent to the state crime labs. So with this legislation, law enforcement, sexual assault nurse examiners, hospitals, and all of those who are impacted by sexual assault will have clear guidelines for the submission and processing of sexual assault kits. And I think it is important to emphasize that this legislation sends a clear message, which is that we can never have another backlog of untested sexual assault kits again in Wisconsin. So I want to thank this coalition for coming together to prepare this legislation. And with that, let me turn it over to Representative Steffen.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today and for my colleagues and Attorney General Josh Kaul. Backlogs and bureaucracy should never be a barrier to justice. And sadly, that has been a situation as it relates to our sexual assault rape kits. While well-intentioned, across the state we have had a patchwork of policies, procedures, and timelines relating to the handling and processing of sexual assault kits throughout the hospitals, clinics, and law enforcement agencies across this great state. This legislation provides some clear, concise, efficient, and agreed upon procedures for ensuring that those kits are delivered to the state crime lab in a way that can ensure that justice can be delivered. I am so thankful to be working with Attorney General Josh Kaul, starting this process with, of course, Attorney General Schimmel, and it shows the bipartisan nature of this issue by having so many great representatives from both parties being a part of this process, and just about every affected group being a part of this solution. And so that's how great legislation is made, and I am so thankful to be a part of it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ian Henderson, and I am the Director of Legal and System Services at the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We would like to thank Attorney General Kaul and the bipartisan group of legislators for introducing this legislation today. This legislation is the culmination of years of work that began with the Attorney General's Sexual Assault Response Team, a multidisciplinary group of advocates, law enforcement officers, forensic nurse examiners, who develop protocols to ensure sexual assault survivors have consistent options regarding the collection of forensic evidence. While those protocols were an important first step, this legislation is absolutely critical to ensure Wisconsin does not experience a backlog of sexual assault kits in the future. Additionally, this legislation provides sexual assault survivors with options regarding engaging with the criminal justice system, including the ability to have a sexual assault kit collected and stored at the crime lab for testing, should they decide later to report to law enforcement. There are a variety of reasons why a survivor may not wish to report to law enforcement, including a fear of not being believed or concerns for their privacy. We also know that women of color are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence, and historically marginalized communities face additional barriers to reporting, which would include a mistrust of engaging with the criminal justice system. This legislation keeps the decision to engage with law enforcement with the survivor. For those who would like to have the forensic evidence collected and to report, the legislation ensures that those kits will be sent to the crime lab for testing. For those who don't want a kit or who want a kit collected but are unsure of reporting, for whatever reason, the legislation ensures that those kits will be stored at the crime lab for up to 10 years, thus providing survivors with the ability to have the kit tested at a later date, should they decide to report to law enforcement. Finally, we would like to acknowledge that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which seeks to raise public awareness about sexual violence. This makes this a particularly opportune time to introduce this legislation, which has such an important system reform component with regard to both the criminal justice system and the healthcare system. And we believe this legislation keeps survivors at the center and does so in a manner that keeps their interests at the forefront. Thank you.
Hello, my name is State Representative Melissa Sargent, and I am really honored to be here with this amazing group of people who have been working really earnestly to address really a horrible and tragic problem that is pervasive across the state of Wisconsin and across our nation. It's no secret that sexual violence is a pervasive problem in our society. Here in the United States, an American is sexually assaulted every 92 seconds. This is jarring and frightening, and it only gets worse from there. If you're a woman, 1 in every 6 women will be a victim of an attempted or a completed rape. A college student, women ages 18 to 24 who are college students are 3 times more likely than women in general to experience sexual violence. A member of our military, of those who reported, and we need to remember this is reported, 14,900 military members experienced unwanted sexual contact in 2016. A member of a tribal nation, Native Americans are twice as likely to experience sexual violence compared to all other races. Incarcerated, an estimated 80,600 inmates each year experience sexual violence while in prison or jail. Or, if you're transgendered or gender nonconforming, 21% of transgendered, genderqueer, and nonconforming college students have been sexually assaulted. Again, these are reported cases. These are numbers that don't even touch on the reality of the real problem that we are facing today, where 3 out of 4 sexual assaults go unreported. We've been talking about this issue for too long, and it's so refreshing to be able to stand up here today with people who are talking in a nonpartisan way, a common sense language, and a pragmatic actions are being taken to stand up for survivors as well as to hold our offenders accountable for these traumatic and life-changing crimes. The prevention of backlogs of untested sexual assault kits is a crucial step in supporting our survivors of sexual violence and ensuring that we have procedures that will uphold the dignity of our survivors and their rights to a fair and just process. Not only does this legislation work to create and codify a procedure that will honor our survivors and to ensure their ability to have sexual assault kits collected, processed, and stored in appropriate timeframes, but it protects those who do not choose to report at the time of an assault, and they may change their minds. This is certainly a hard conversation to have, and reporting can be one of the most challenging steps that survivors take, and they deserve to have the respect to report and be ready to have their stored kit there when they are ready to report. The time frame specified in this legislation will take into account the traumatic nature of these crimes, and it will provide that we have necessary parameters set forth. We find ourselves today in a truly awful situation, and we need to take this action today. Preventing the future backlog of untested sexual assault kits is imperative, and it provides an important opportunity for us to change this conversation. Change the conversation around sexual violence and how it is that we choose to prioritize this as a state. I am so proud to be standing up here with my colleagues from the state legislature, community advocates, and Attorney General Kaul in order to support this legislation, as well as to stand in solidarity with all of the survivors, past and future, in the instances of sexual violence in Wisconsin. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Council, and I am the president of the Wisconsin chapter of the International Association of Forensic Nurses. First, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of our state's forensic nurses. Second, I want to acknowledge that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and I am grateful for all of my colleagues who dedicate their careers to the survivors of violence. As a state chapter of an international association that provides care for victims of violence, forensic nurses across the state of Wisconsin strive to improve the health of all individuals who are victimized by interpersonal violence. As we provide medical care, evidence collection, and education to victims, we understand as members of the health community that we cannot ignore the consequences of violent behavior, as we see firsthand the damaging effects this type of victimization has on our society. Historically, by working together, forensic nurses, advocacy centers, law enforcement agencies, and the criminal justice system can bring about change that successfully results in ensuring victims are provided with patient-centered options that best suits that patient's needs. The forensic nurse does this while showing respect and compassion throughout the entire length of that patient's exam and helping to facilitate services for support throughout the criminal justice process. On behalf of the forensic nurses in our state, we support this legislation as it supports victims and their choices with their evidence. Victims may be afraid to seek care due to knowing the suspect or fear of victim blaming. This legislation gives these victims the option to have evidence collected and stored for preservation for up to 10 years anonymously. This legislation also outlines the protection and immunity for forensic nurses, healthcare workers, and the healthcare facilities involved in evidence collection in an effort to assist law enforcement officials. New standards, which law enforcement must adhere to, will strengthen and support community and statewide forensic nursing initiatives regarding kit collection. This legislative piece will assist law enforcement in maintaining accountability to this patient population. By collaborating with law enforcement, the Wisconsin Department of Justice, and the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, our goal is to ensure the prevention of future forensic evidence collection kit backlogs and to instill a timely and patient-centered process for the collection and processing of the kits. It is important to note that the forensic nurses in our state are highly skilled, trained, and are experts in the field of sexual and interpersonal violence. We take great pride in our work with all victims, regardless of their age, race, gender, or other distinguishing factors. No one is turned away from our care services. We have the ability to give survivors options to be heard, as well as providing a network of support, which puts the power back in the hands of the survivors. We are one of the beginning steps in their journey, but an important and powerful resource with the state. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Senator Rob Cowles. I'm happy to help on the Senate side. I want to congratulate the new Attorney General Kaul, Representative Steffen, all my colleagues. It's great to be here with these incredible advocates. We all saw the stories in the press for the last year or so, quite confusing. We all believe that this will clear up that confusion to a large extent and provide better safety. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Zavadsky. I'm the police chief for the City of Beloit Police Department. And as many of my colleagues have commented here already, sexual assault is extremely traumatic for the victims, and as a result, many of them never obtain a sexual assault forensic exam or report the crime, often due to the immediate fear that doing so will result in additional trauma. There are others who do report the crime with the legitimate expectation that any DNA evidence collected in the exam is expeditiously processed, sent to the crime lab, and processed by our Crime Lab Bureau personnel. Law enforcement is acutely aware that those who commit sexual assault often continue to commit these crimes until they're apprehended. And in many instances, these offenders traverse jurisdictional boundaries from cities and towns to college campuses across our communities. We want to prevent those crimes and get those folks off our streets. Wisconsin's Crime Lab Bureau is one of the best in the nation and implements the most advanced DNA technology to help law enforcement accomplish that task. This bill contains needed oversight and accountability for sexual assault kits and the vital DNA evidence they contain. This in turn preserves both the victim's ability to decide upon reporting and law enforcement's ability to investigate and identify sexual assault offenders, many of whom victimize again and again. The Beloit Police Department and the City of Beloit is honored to work with the Attorney General's office and to have been a part of the collaborative group of criminal justice colleagues and professionals who put great effort into addressing gaps in sexual assault evidentiary processes in Wisconsin. We believe the bill will not only eliminate future backlog issues, but will keep our community safer and prevent future victimization. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we are happy to take any questions that people have.
Josh, maybe whoever can answer this, what has been the biggest problem in getting to this point? Why did it take so long to come together with this bill? It seems pretty straightforward on paper. I'm sure it's not, but can someone address what the hang-up has been?
So there are a number of complicated issues that are being addressed by this legislation. Representative Sargent, for example, talked about situations in which a survivor may come forward and have evidence collected but not want to report. And this is a mandate on law enforcement across the state. And that's something you want to make sure you get broad input on from law enforcement, from survivors, and from a broad coalition. And so what we've been able to do is have this group come together to work through some of these difficult issues and propose legislation that has been able to be supported by a broad coalition of groups and a bipartisan group of legislators. And so it's our hope that this legislation will move through the legislature quickly.
Would this legislation apply to military law enforcement as well?
This would apply to anybody within the jurisdiction of the state of Wisconsin.
What the National Guard told us last week is they have a similar process where they have a restricted and unrestricted, and in the restricted process they don't in turn report the information on to law enforcement. So would that be mandated on them?
So this wouldn't apply to the reporting of information about sexual assault kits. This is specifically relates to sexual assault kits that are collected. Those typically would be collected by a sexual assault nurse examiner at a hospital, and at that point the nurse would either contact law enforcement if the survivor chose to report, or would send the kit to the crime labs if the survivor didn't report.
How dependent is this legislation on your budget request?
It's not. This is independent of our budget request, but I will say, obviously one of the things we want to make sure happens after sexual assault kits are submitted to the crime labs is that they're tested expeditiously, and one of the ways we can make sure that happens is by having sufficient resources at the crime labs.
Do you anticipate that this will lead to a significant increase in the number of sexual assault kits being processed, and are the crime labs ready for that?
So because of the Psaki project that's been going on, there has been a concerted effort to ensure that kits from around the state are being submitted to the crime labs. And actually that process involved the submission of a number of kits. So I think that any increase we see is one that the crime labs are in a strong position to be able to handle, although, as I mentioned, we do have a request for some more resources there.
But those resources?
Well, obviously the more resources we have, the faster the testing can be conducted. But But one thing I do hope that this results in also is, and you can see we have a bipartisan group of legislators, we have people representing a number of different agencies. We're hoping that this sends a clear message that the state of Wisconsin is standing up for survivors of sexual assault, and hopefully this will make clear to people that if they come forward, they're going to be supported, and that they have a number of people who are working to strengthen our response to sexual assault cases.
How often does it happen where a victim does not immediately wish to report it and then they come back later and say, I do want to report it? Is that something that happens often?
I'm going to let our sexual assault nurse examiner representative speak to the way that works out typically.
So, from what we know, typically if they do send the kit, most of them are reporting within like 2 weeks to a few months. And then when that happens, they would contact law enforcement. Law enforcement then would ask if they had a kit done. Law enforcement would then contact the place where the kit was done, because we have a number on the kit. So it's stored at the crime lab as a Jane or John Doe, but that kit identifies that patient by a number. So we then would give them the number, and then they would contact crime lab and pull that kit and start their investigation.
So does it happen often where they actually come back and say, you know, I didn't wish to report it before, but now I choose to?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that, this is a relatively new process. It's one that is in effect now. This would codify that process. But one of the things that we hope that this process does, and particularly codifying it will do, is in cases where a survivor is not sure whether he or she wants to report, this hopefully will encourage those folks to come forward and have an exam conducted so that evidence is available if that person decides ultimately to report to law enforcement and pursue a prosecution.
Have you gotten any assurances from the governor that he's supportive, and for the lawmakers, is there any assurance from leadership that they're behind the bill?
I don't have any particular assurances I can point to, but my suspicion is that this is a bill that is going to have broad support. I think this group reflects that, and it is one that we as a group are committed to encouraging the legislature to pass expeditiously and the governor to sign.
Does this mirror any legislation in other states?
Many other states have similar legislation. Some states, different states have different specifics with respect to legislation regarding sexual assault kits. One thing that is important to note about this legislation, I think, is that it is fairly comprehensive legislation. It addresses timeline for submission. It addresses situations in which a survivor chooses to consent to testing or not to report to law enforcement. It also addresses data collection, and hopefully we'll be reporting on data regularly based on the data that's collected. And so this does include elements that you see in other states, but it's fairly comprehensive.
Can you talk about that data and exactly what data and what would happen to that data?
So one of the things that the Department of Justice will be collecting is data about the processing of sexual assault kits at law enforcement agencies around the state. I mentioned before that the Beloit Police Department had done an inventory, which I think is a really good model. But one of the things we'd like to see is both data regarding the number of kits that are submitted to law enforcement, how long the process takes for those kits to be submitted to the crime labs, and whether there are any untested kits that are at law enforcement agencies, because that's the thing we want to make sure we know about if it's happening, which is if there are kits that have been received by law enforcement that haven't been submitted to the crime labs, that's how you end up with a backlog. And so by collecting data, we can hopefully ensure that that doesn't happen. All right.
Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you all for your time.
Thank you, everyone.